On October 7th, 2008, the United Kingdom was literally on the verge of bankruptcy because of a bank there, the Royal Bank of Scotland, known for its abbreviation, RBS. This bank was literally going to go bankrupt to the point that it did not have enough money for one day. The government at the time only had 24 hours. To create a rescue plan to save this bank and also to save the entire British economy, today we will tell the story of the bank, how it started small until it had assets exceeding 2.2 trillion, and how it reached a point where it was on the verge of bankruptcy overnight, which would have taken the entire British economy down with it. Welcome to the channel, which specializes in economics and e-commerce. Don't forget to support us by subscribing to the channel and liking this video. Now let's start the story from the beginning. The Royal Bank of Scotland, or RBS, is not just an ordinary bank. It is a very large economic institution that owns and controls many banking brands both within and outside the UK. It offers private banking services, financing, and insurance services through its offices located in Europe, North America, and Asia. At that time, the CEO of the bank was Fred Goodwin. After these acquisitions, RBS became one of the largest banks operating on the international economic stage, with branches spread across more than 27 different countries. Also, the growth of this bank in the United States of America was very strong after it also acquired more than one bank in the United States of America, noting that these banks were working at that time in the field of mortgages. On the evening of October 7th, 2008, and specifically at 8 o'clock in the morning, the bank manager was about to give a speech with a group of major investors. Investors from international banks. We would like to point out that a month before this meeting, the famous American bank Lehman Brothers was collapsing unexpectedly due to the massive losses caused by mortgage activities in the United States. The bankruptcy of this bank was a huge event, and there were at least over 1,000 major investors involved with this bank. The important thing is that the share price of Royal Bank of Scotland fell by more than 20% of its value and fell very sharply in recent years during the meeting of the CEO, Fred Goodwin, who was speaking and explaining the development plans and ambitions that he has in order to expand the economic activity of the bank. And before he finished his speech, one of the attendees stood up and said to him, "If everything is going well at the bank as you say, then why did the stock price drop by more than 35% just during this speech?" Of course, the bank manager was hearing this news for the first time, so he left the meeting and went quickly. In fact, the story of the fall of RBS began about 20 years before that, in the 80s. All of the bank managers had strong banking qualifications. But after the Royal Bank of Scotland survived the acquisition of a very large share of its own, he decided to change its entire management team and brought in a new CEO, George Matthews, who became the bank's director of strategic planning. This man terminated the service of many old managers and old planning managers as well, and formed a new team and made a very strong plan to make radical updates in the bank at this time, a plan called Project Columbus, and indeed all payment systems and credit systems were restructured and sales operations were restructured, and it was the first bank to provide banking services via telephone. It was a pioneering project, and it actually succeeded in developing the bank, and by 1997 it tripled the bank's profits to more than 800 million Jordanian dinars per year. But as we said, the wide acquisitions, the acquisitions that were sometimes unjustified and were done with or without reason. Also, the acquisition of financial institutions involved in mortgage lending in the United States of America. This is what caused the big problem in the bank and brought it to the verge of bankruptcy. Of course, the Prime Minister, along with senior economists, had to act quickly to put together an emergency rescue plan for this bank, because the potential failure of RBS would create panic among investors in Britain at that time. Also, investors in the economic companies managed by this bank in the United States of America should know that the British Treasury at that time was also monitoring other banks that were struggling, such as HPOS Bank, which is a banking and insurance company in Britain and was at that time affiliated with Lloyds, or the Lloyds Banking Group, and they were preparing an urgent rescue plan for the entire banking system. But the RBS problem caught them off guard at the time. They were basically in a major crisis. The Treasury rescue plan to address this crisis was based on, or depended on, pumping very large sums of money. There were loan guarantees of more than £250 billion, and the asset protection plan and depositors' money was almost the same amount. If RBS had failed, the British government was afraid that it would have a domino effect in the banking economic system there. That is, it was going to collapse and take with it very large banks and economic institutions. To stop this impact, the government promised to cover losses up to $500 billion, and this was solely to secure the banking system. We should note that this had to be completed before the next day, which was Wednesday, and the morning of the following day. In our names in the morning, because this time is the market opening time for the next day. The bank's bailout plan relied on the government being the largest shareholder in the bank. For your information, this bank, RBS, was at its peak in 2005, and due to the international acquisitions it made, it became one of the top 5 banks in the world, with more than 25% of its profits coming from banking operations in the United States. In September 2007, the escalating credit crisis in the financial markets led to the first attack on a British bank, which was Northern Rock, and it collapsed significantly at that time. However, even after this event, it did not affect the plans of the CEO of RBS at the time. On the contrary, it continued with very large acquisitions, and also paid a record amount for the acquisition of ABN AMRO, spending nearly 71 billion euros. After the bank acquired ABN AMRO, RBS's assets were estimated to be around 2.2 trillion pounds, 10 trillion pounds sterling. But this year in particular, more than 1 million Americans were threatened with losing their homes due to the mortgage problem in the United States of America. This huge new RBS bank balance sheet contains very large amounts of toxic mortgage packages, or what are called CDOS, which we will of course talk about later in a full episode. One of RBS's main banks, Greenwich Capital, which specialized in mortgages, had already begun losing tens of millions of dollars a month starting in July due to the same mortgage issue. Also at that time, the American bank Human Brothers collapsed and filed a formal request to the government to declare it bankrupt. The important thing is that the next day, in the early hours of Wednesday morning, the largest British banks agreed, of course with the government, that they would sign a rescue plan for RBS Bank. The proposal was that they would inject 50 billion pounds sterling into the system in order to provide liquidity and capital within the banks. But of course, this large number, it would shock depositors, because this figure indicates that the banks are facing a real economic disaster that requires the government to intervene with such a large amount of capital. However, in the end, an agreement was reached, and indeed at 7 a.m. on Wednesday, the British Treasury signed the agreement to take over RBS in exchange for $50 billion. In the end, we can say that if it weren't for the British government's intervention and this massive bailout plan, the entire British banking system would have collapsed. This was not just about saving a bank, it was about saving the financial system of an entire country. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and support us by liking the video and sharing it. I'll see you in the next video. Good evening.